The Ukrainian Kherson counteroffensive in 2022 may have been one of the most telegraphed military operations in human history. But if so, it would only hold the title for a relatively short time, as Ukraine's much anticipated 2023 counteroffensive has been the subject of a level of public discussion and rumours more akin to a major sporting event than a serious surprise military undertaking. And indeed, some of the military preparations on both sides have been about as secret as the Super Bowl, with camera crews at various times invited to observe both new Ukrainian units training and forming for offensive operations, and also Russian units digging entrenchments and preparing defensive positions. All the while, some international media, desperately looking for a potential dramatic development in a war that has been all too often defined by slow-moving positional fighting, have steadily built anticipation to the point where you'd be forgiven for thinking that the upcoming offensive is destined to end the war in a single great push. Add in allegedly one of the largest leaks of US classified documents in recent memory, and you can understand how this topic has managed to hold the headlines despite precious little actually happening. There have also been numerous false starts. Predicted start windows, even some put forward by Russian figures like Evgeny Prigozhin, have come and gone, while every skirmish or scouting mission seems to spawn posts and videos declaring that this is it, the time has come, and the great offensive is here. But despite all the false starts, our best guess is despite the brutal fighting over winter and early spring, the combination of better weather and strategic pressures mean that something probably is coming and coming soon. And so today I wanted to ask how ready both sides appear to be for that potential offensive, why a Ukrainian offensive seems like a pretty safe bet, and what the potential results are for Ukraine's 2023 campaign season. Any offensive represents a significant risk by the Ukrainian armed forces, and so I want to ask why they're likely willing to put their chips on the table, and what the results of the hand might be, win, lose or draw. In talking about the upcoming offensive, I want to set the context first. That means talking about the results of the fighting through April, what we learnt from the Pentagon leaks, and what we can tell about the current state of force readiness both amongst the Ukrainians and the Russians. Then I want to move on to the potential offensive itself, both in terms of the initial actions we've seen both sides launching in order to try and shape the potential battlefield, and also some of the results we might expect and the implications those would have. Because while I think there's little doubt that what we're about to see is very, very important for the fate of Ukraine and its people, it's exceedingly unlikely that it ends up with Russian tanks rolling through Kyiv or Ukraine hoisting the blue and yellow over Red Square. So I think setting expectations is important, as is understanding that this war is now quite likely to roll on into 2024. And then finally, as is often my way, I want to zoom out and give a little bit of a big picture, namely by asking why, despite having seen what happened to Russian units at places like Avdiivka or Vuhledar, Ukraine might be willing to give away the advantages it currently enjoys as a defender to go onto the counterattack, and how that decision-making interacts with the way this war continues to evolve. So I want to start by looking at the fighting over the month of April, because while many were focused on Ukraine's preparation for a counteroffensive, elements of Russia's winter offensive around places like Bakhmut continued into the spring. And that fighting is significant not just because it helps set the conditions in which the current offensive is likely to play out, but also because it demonstrated the way both sides were continuing to change and evolve their tactics and techniques to seek an advantage. Both sides, for example, have started to make much larger use of airdropped guided bombs. For Russia, these have become a hard-hitting alternative to artillery rounds, giving Russian aircraft the opportunity to engage Ukrainian targets safely beyond the range of Ukrainian air defences. And Ukraine now reports being hit by up to 20 of these devices every single day. Far cheaper than extended-range precision ordnance like cruise missiles, these guided bombs have seen extensive use in places like Bakhmut. Meanwhile, Ukraine has returned the favour, albeit on a smaller scale, by deploying the American extended-range JDAM. And they seem to have done so with a similar objective in mind based on the evidence available to us, with the Ukrainian Air Force using the extended-range JDAM to safely put very large warheads on entrenched Russian positions that might be resistant to something smaller like a 155mm artillery shell or a Gimler's rocket. The Ukrainians have also made escalating use of cheap and affordable one-way kamikaze drones, in that case more often for an anti-logistics campaign that we'll talk about a little later on. But while the April battles saw new weapons introduced in ever greater quantities, most of the fighting occurred over the same old locations, as cities like Bakhmut and Avdiivka fought on. At time of recording, the battle for Bakhmut has entered its 10th month, and despite periods of immense danger, the defenders still hold on to part of the city. After the fall of Soledar to Wagner forces, it became clear that the apparent Russian plan was to encircle the city, trapping Ukrainian defenders inside. It was openly claimed in public that American generals had advised the Ukrainians to withdraw from the city, and Western military experts openly questioned the decision to remain, but remain the Ukrainians did. Instead of withdrawing, the Ukrainian military committed reserves to the city, and at great cost and with great difficulty, they managed to hold the critical supply lines open. I need to emphasize here that sources on both sides stress that this was no easy fighting, and the videos we do have of the remaining road into Bakhmut show it strewn with destroyed vehicles, as the combination of mud, terrible conditions, and Russian artillery fire make traversing that road about as safe as a tourist trying to drive the Champs-Élysées roundabout. But the end result was the Russians being held back, and despite claiming to have done so on multiple occasions, the Russians would never actually succeed in encircling the city. And so, facing increasing demands to take the city but unable to encircle it, Wagner and Russian forces came up with a creative solution to overcome the deadlock. Namely, they appear to have decided to simply bash their way through the urban terrain of Bakhmut, block by block and street by street. Now, normally this is something a military force would want to avoid almost at all cost. One just has to remember the difficulties the Americans faced fighting the Battle of Fallujah in Iraq, and that was against a greatly outnumbered and massively undergunned opponent. In Ukraine, the urban defenders would be deeply determined and very well armed. And so the result wasn't any sort of sweeping advance, but rather a grinding one that moved perhaps a block every 2 days. As they retreated, the Ukrainians reportedly brought in a tactic of rigging their former positions to explode. That would reportedly leave Russians in a dilemma. If they took over the defensible former Ukrainian positions in something like an apartment building, the building might explode underneath them, causing mass casualties. But if they avoided occupying those defensible positions, they might be vulnerable to a counterattack. And so a number of buildings would end up falling more than once, and entire sections of the city would be almost completely leveled. Wagner would be able to advance provided it received artillery support, but it would nonetheless be at great human cost. After one day in which he claimed a 130-metre advance, for example, Yevgeny Prigozhin said that Wagner had suffered more than 100 losses that same day. And as at time of recording, the city has not entirely fallen. Ukrainian forces remain dug in on the western extreme of the city, including in a number of high-rise buildings. To put all of this in perspective, when I made my Bakhmut video in December of 2022, we were talking about Russian offensive actions over the Bakhmut garbage dump. On the screen there, I've marked that location as well as the distance to where the front line stands reportedly at time of recording. That distance, representing nearly 5 months of fighting, is about 4.2 kilometres. As for the cost to Wagner and supporting units as a fighting force, we'll talk about those soon. As for the April fighting around the city of Avdiivka, one of the other objectives of Russia's winter offensive, well, I have the maps up there on screen. Whenever I try and talk about economics or resource inputs and outputs, I'm often scolded by pro-Russian commentators that I'm looking at it all wrong, and if I want to understand whether Russia is winning, I just need to look at the map. Well, there it is, a map covering another month of offensive action around one of Russia's key objectives. And the result, depending on how you measure it, is actually a net loss in terrain controlled. The situation thus isn't much changed from where it was in mid-March, when the former FSB agent Igor Girkin observed that Avdiivka wasn't even remotely close to being encircled, and that it remained a well-fortified bastion. Military affairs, as in life, there is a difference between a grinding advance and banging your head against a stone wall without result. And in April, despite the intense cost to the armed forces of Ukraine, Russia's offensive actions seem to have fallen into the second category. At the rate Russia was advancing in February or March, it might have taken centuries to complete the occupation of Ukraine. But based on April's figures, even if Vladimir Putin was to obtain immortality, it would not be enough. As on net, Ukraine actually succeeded in gaining back approximately 25 square kilometres of its own territory. Now, that certainly doesn't represent a definitive end to the fighting. The situation in Bakhmut obviously remains precarious. But if we're trying to assess the state of the two forces, Ukrainian and Russian, ahead of a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive, then the fighting of April might provide a couple of clues. Another set of potential clues came courtesy of an unexpected source, when a large trove of classified American documents found themselves dumped on the internet. Now, I thought long and hard about whether or not to cover this issue at all. As bizarre as the story is, we're still talking about controlled documents here. So as we go through this, keep in mind that I'll be limiting myself to documents and findings that have been published at least somewhere in the media. Last month it was reported that a 21-year-old American Air National Guardsman had been arrested for allegedly placing a treasure trove of classified American documents on an online chat group. And to what I'm sure is the great relief of the Gaijin executive, for once we are not talking about the War Thunder forums. Instead, we're talking about places on Discord so obscure that allegedly the documents were up for some time before anyone, really noticed that they were there. Now, it's impossible to know what sort of motivation might have driven a young man to dump a large number of classified documents on an obscure Discord server. So on a completely unrelated note, I'd like to make the following suggestion. If you're trying to win popularity on the internet, there are options that don't involve potential prison sentences. There's a near infinite number of things you can safely flex over. You can tell the world how cute your pet is, how much you bench, or how much you made on the stock market. I can't guarantee it'll work, but it is much safer than dumping work files on the internet. It's kind of like trying to get ahead in a job by bragging that you're able to break into the boss's office without being found out. A, it's a weird flex, B, it's probably not going to help you, and C, the time from disclosure to consequence is probably going to be measured in hours. What's probably more certain than motivation is the alleged content, which reportedly spreads not just the war in Ukraine, but also topics far removed from it. Now, as soon as this story broke, the question was immediately asked, could a 21-year-old Air National Guardsman possibly have had access to this sort of information? And for what it's worth, my answer to that is it's certainly credible. Clearance, position, and need to know usually determines access to classified information, not age. And Teixeira is reported to have been part of an intelligence wing. More than that, when the Bellingcat group went through some of the leaked documents, they found that at least one had been tagged as having been analysed, apparently, by an Air National Guard intelligence unit in North Dakota. Not Teixeira's unit, but still something relatively similar. So in my view, it doesn't strain credibility too far that Teixeira in the Massachusetts Air National Guard may have had a degree of access. As for whether the documents as they've hit the internet are credible, legitimate, that's a complicated question. For my part, I would advise extraordinary caution with material like this that makes its way onto the internet. Because for one, we're not talking about just a single document. And amongst those that have been reported on, at least one appears to have been a clear fabrication or a Photoshop edit. There are documents that have, at the very least, errors or questions attached to them. For example, Bellingcat found in one of them that the coordinates attached to the object in question were simply wrong. The object described in the documents and the object described in the associated coordinates were something like a 40-minute car drive apart. And then there are those at first glance that don't seem to have any obvious faults, and thus may potentially represent genuine intelligence products, although it's impossible to know for sure. And again, that's while only talking about those documents that have made their way into the wider media ecosystem. But what's for certain is that the documents did have an outsized impact on the information space. And while I don't see a need to cover everything that those documents allegedly covered, there are a few reported points that might be directly relevant to the upcoming Ukrainian offensive that are worth looking at. The first is the question of casualties that have been suffered by the Ukrainians and the Russians since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. Now, one of the leaked document pages included a little information box in the bottom left-hand corner called Total Assessed Losses. This included low-confidence estimates of Russian and Ukrainian, KIA, and a number of other loss figures since February of last year. Now, two versions of that document ended up being circulated around the internet. The first looks like and may be the original image. It shows a ratio of killed in action between the Russians and Ukrainians of between 2.1 and 2.8 Russians for every Ukrainian, and an upper-end Ukrainian KIA estimate of around 17,000, which, while horrifying as a prospect, is something you would expect to be well within the means of a nation of 30 or 40 million people to endure. For a little bit of historical context, the population of Australia in 1914 was short of 5 million, but 60,000 would be killed in World War I. Now, it appears that those numbers weren't considered convenient to some of the pro-Russians on the internet, and so a second doctored version began to circulate. This seemingly awful Photoshop engaged in some artistic license. The old Ukrainian KIA estimates became the Russian KIA estimates, so now Russia had lost a maximum of just over 17,000 people. And then to create higher Ukrainian estimates, they swapped the digits. So 17,000 became 71,000. To reduce Russian vehicle and aircraft losses, they simply cut a 0 from each figure. The number of fixed-wing aircraft lost, for example, became 7, despite us having visual evidence of something like 10 times that many being lost. If you heard pro-Russian commentators say the Pentagon leaks suggested a 7-to-1 KIA ratio between Russia and Ukraine, this is likely where they got it from. Now, on one hand, you'd think that no one would fall for these figures. For one, the quality of the apparent Photoshop isn't particularly good. The numbers don't even line up. Secondly, I would think it would seem pretty coincidental that the losses on both rows just happen to be the same digits slightly rearranged. Then there's the fact that both rows of losses are categorized the same way as moderately sustainable, despite the fact that apparently the larger force is taking a seventh of the casualties. And then most incredibly to me is the fact that those same estimates don't just appear on one page, they appear at multiple places across the documents, but they've only been edited in one of them. So my view is, in order for someone to go with this 7-to-1 ratio, they would need to look at what looks like a low-resolution bad Photoshop job of one item on one page, and conclude that that is the genuine information and every other bit of the rest of the documents has been altered. So, of course, that 7-to-1 figure did find its way onto Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News. In any case, the figures in what looks more like an original version of the document track very closely with the official figures that have been released by Western sources over the last several months. They suggest that Ukraine is inflicting disproportionate casualties on the Russian military, although not as disproportionate as some of the more optimistic pro-Ukrainian projections. Again, though, I want to stress that these are self-described as low-confidence estimates, and I would be deeply cautious about how I choose to regard them. The second item to dominate headlines was the material ostensibly dealing with Ukraine's air defences, with this being reported as a headline that Ukraine was going to run out of air defence interceptors by May. And here we weren't just talking about a select few outlets, it was widely reported. But that headline kind of misses a few caveats contained in the document as it has been published and made available. For one, it was based on an assumption of a much higher tempo of Russian missile attack than we've actually seen. There were meant to be 3 full-scale attacks in March, for example. In reality, there was 1. Nor did it appear to factor a number of the deliveries the document itself referenced or some of the changes intended to prolong the lifespan of Ukraine's air defences into that May timeline. It also just included some wonky math and strange detail in places, but that's mostly beside the point. The key point is more that by the time these documents were published and these headlines were written, it was already clear that the assumptions contained in the document wouldn't hold. Russia's missile campaign was slowing down, not escalating. And it also assumes that Ukraine would just keep firing interceptors until it had nothing left, giving Russian aircraft free rein over Ukrainian airspace. That makes about as much sense as Russia running itself completely out of missiles or some other critical weapon system. No one fires artillery shells until they run completely out. Similarly, it's reasonable to expect that Ukraine wouldn't fire off its last interceptors, it would change its protocol on what it targets and fires at. It might, for example, have to make uncomfortable decisions, like not engaging incoming drones or certain cruise missiles. Instead, it could reserve its remaining stock of S-300 interceptors, for example, for more valuable targets like Russian aircraft. So even assuming that every element of this document is accurate, I don't think the reporting that there is some imminent threat of Russia obtaining air superiority holds true. Although that doesn't mean that depleting its ground-based air defences isn't a major risk for Ukraine going forward. It helps explain, for example, why over the last several months we've seen visual evidence of ongoing efforts to keep Ukraine's Soviet-era air defences in the fight. There were recent images, for example, of what look like Jordanian missiles being loaded on Ukrainian OSA systems. I've talked before about the concept of combining American AIM-7 missiles with Soviet-era Buk missile launchers. And there are cases of Central and Eastern European allies that have provided Soviet systems and Soviet missiles to Ukraine in their entirety, like the SA-125 system, the 2K-12, or the S-300s from Slovakia. These and other measures, like trying to find every available missile on the world market to send to Ukraine, are all aimed at extending the lifespan of Ukraine's Soviet stocks. But eventually, as we've been reporting for months, these stocks are going to become more and more constrained. After all, the biggest global supplier is Russia. And outside of particular moments of extensive generosity, like during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Russia isn't generally in the mood to share its weapon supplies with the Ukrainians. which is why we also hear about the announcement or delivery of Western-style air defense systems. Now, to be fair, these are not full one-to-one replacements for many of Ukraine's Soviet systems. Most, for example, have a considerably shorter range than the S-300 does. But every Western system introduced that can be sustained using Western interceptors takes pressure off the existing Ukrainian arsenal. It lowers that burn rate and increases the period before they become severely supply constrained. Ukraine now, for example, has its first Patriot battery, it'll have its first SAMP-T battery next month, and another Patriot battery sometime soon. 8 NASAMS batteries are believed to be in country, 2 of the 4 IRIS-T systems from Germany are believed to be in country. And then there's a strange hodgepodge collection of just about everything else that will lob a missile into the sky with some degree of efficacy. Now again, in order to replace their existing systems entirely, the Ukrainians would probably need something like 20 Patriot and SAMP-T batteries, not 3. But if the concern is can the Ukrainians keep their airspace contested over the next several months in order to enable some sort of counteroffensive action, then barring some massive unexpected change, the numbers as I've seen them suggest they can probably do it. In fact, taken together, I'd say that most of the documents that have been openly published don't tell us much that we didn't already suspect. Russia are taking disproportionate casualties, Ukraine desperately needs more air defences, and Bakhmut would be a horrible holiday destination at the moment. But while the headlines were either deceptive or over the top in many places, that doesn't mean the release of these documents wasn't deeply embarrassing. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that no one comes out of this looking particularly good. For Russia, the information contained within was actually pretty damning of both the Russian war effort and also their counterintelligence efforts. In many ways, it seems like the Americans knew a lot more about the Russian forces than they did about the Ukrainians. For Ukraine, it highlighted well-known issues with ammunition supply as well as the challenge that now faces them in a counteroffensive. But I'd argue that by far the biggest loser of the whole thing was the United States. Having sensitive intelligence leaked is always a damaging and embarrassing experience. But having them allegedly released somewhere called Thug Shaker Central probably adds a different layer of insult to injury, and probably caps off a not altogether great month for the Air National Guard. After all, in the same month, another 21-year-old Air National Guardsman, this time from Tennessee, was reportedly arrested by the FBI after applying to become an assassin on the satirical website Rent a Hitman. But the purpose of covering the leaks isn't to question the recruiting decisions of the Air National Guard. Instead, it was to look for clues to an altogether more important issue: the question of the strength and quality of the opposing forces on the eve of Ukraine's expected counteroffensive. This is important for pretty intuitive reasons. While historically the outcome of military campaigns can owe a lot to things like a good plan, random chance, the weather, and a dozen factors besides, quantity and quality of opposing forces are 2 things that usually matter, with a good rule of thumb being that the attacker needs 3 times as much combat power as a defender in order to overcome a fortified opponent. Now importantly, that superiority doesn't have to be numerical, quality can go a long way. And that superiority doesn't have to stretch along an entire front, it's sufficient that it be local. But if you're trying to assess how likely it is, for example, that Ukraine is able to obtain that sort of local superiority in order to make some sort of a breakthrough, well, it helps to understand what quality and quantity of forces might be available to the 2 sides after the hard winter fighting. And of those 2 points, quality and quantity can be by far the harder one to assess from a distance. You can count tanks by satellite all day long, but in a war that is increasingly being fought between mobilised personnel, sometimes with abbreviated training programs led by reserve or new officers, it's helpful to know where those tank crews sit on a spectrum from Kolobanov reincarnated to Private Conscriptovich's tanker cousin who's still trying to figure out how to change gears. As you might expect, there are very mixed messages coming out of the Russian side of the information space. One thing I'd suggest is when you look at these various commentators, ask what their motivations might be and how that might impact what they choose to say. The spokesman for the Russian MOD, for example, Konashenkov, and the spokesman for the Kremlin, Peskov, say that everything is going according to plan, Russia's not planning an additional mobilization, everything is fine. Contrast that with commentators like Strelkov, for example, who are fervently pro-Russian, but want the Russian government to be doing a lot more to win the war. Strelkov describes the winter and early spring campaign as a failure, Wagner as having been bled out, many of the Russian army's storm units having been exhausted around Avdiivka or Bakhmut. And then there's Prigozhin, the head of Wagner Group, who obviously has his own interests. Up to this point, Prigozhin has been pretty open about blaming the Russian MOD for not supplying Wagner with enough ammunition, and as a result, he argues, forcing Wagner to take far more casualties than it otherwise would. That would seem to align with some of Prigozhin's potential interests, like securing additional supplies for Wagner Group or excusing the fact that they haven't advanced faster. But recently, he's taken this to a whole new level. Very recently, for example, Prigozhin recorded a video with him standing in front of a field of dead Wagner troops. In that video and a separate alleged document, he claims their death was largely driven by a deliberate decision to deprive Wagner of ammunition supplies. And referring to the defense minister of the Russian Federation, Sergei Shoigu, and the commander of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, Prigozhin says, quote, "Where are the effing shells?" Now obviously this is clearly a standard method of communication in any army and suggests that everything is going just fine. But soon after this video released, Prigozhin also released another. In that, he claimed that Wagner had been given the task of taking all of Bakhmut by the 9th of May, and that in response to that, the Russian army had deliberately denied Wagner Group ammunition supplies to guarantee that they failed. As a result, he declares that he will be unilaterally withdrawing the Wagner Group from Bakhmut on the 10th of May. Now, some armies might call that an act of potential mutiny. In Russia, you might call it everyday office politics. But either way, while I wouldn't want to read too much into the theatrics, it doesn't point to the most cohesive of relationships between Wagner and the MOD. As for every other element of what he said, I would advise caution. At time of recording, Ukrainian sources are saying there's no sign of Wagner leaving Bakhmut. Instead, they're attacking relentlessly, potentially bringing in reinforcements and dousing Ukrainian-controlled sections of the city in incendiary weapons. More concrete clues on Russian force status might be found not in what they say, but in what the Russian army has done over the last several months. In particular, it's worth noting that Russia has disproportionately relied on certain units to carry out its offensive actions while other forces mostly defend. This is obviously not universally true. We've seen some motor rifle units used in offensive actions, but disproportionately we've seen naval infantry, airborne, and private military contractors used in these storm actions. As well, it must also be said, as specially formed assault units at Vuhledar, at Bakhmut, at Avdiivka, and at Marinka. That suggests the Russian military might not have confidence in the ability of some of its other units to carry out complex operations. Another observation is it seems to be that the Russians have moved forces and resources between some of the key points of contact, units and resources being diverted from Bakhmut to Avdiivka, for example, or vice versa. Alexander Khodorkovsky, for example, claimed the ammunition that should have gone to support the Vuhledar offensive was diverted to Bakhmut, and similar competing claims have been made about the diversion of potential reinforcements. Now, if Russia still had an inexhaustible pool of ammunition to supply from, or if it had a large number of reserve units that were highly capable, you would have expected it to potentially reinforce all three at the same time to maximize pressure on the Ukrainians. Instead of reducing pressure at one location in order to increase it at another, why not simply dial up the pressure at all three locations to see what breaks? That might suggest a constrained pool of Russian replacements and resources. And then there's essentially a mathematical question which might speak to force quality, and that is that it was reported by a number of sources that the Pentagon leaks suggested that on certain areas of the front, the Russians vastly outnumbered the Ukrainian defenders. This didn't hold true in Bakhmut, but it did allegedly hold true in Luhansk or in certain parts of the south. And yet those areas didn't see any significant Russian advances, or indeed in some cases saw limited Ukrainian gains. Now, there are a lot of reasons that could go into explaining that. The estimates in the documents could be wrong or could have been incorrectly reported, for example. But when setting up a simulated wargame, one thing planners will try and do is assess the relative combat value of a unit on one side versus a unit on the other. There has to be an adjustment to reflect training, tactics, equipment, motivation, and all of those other factors. And if there have been areas of the front where outnumbered Ukrainian forces are not just able to hold but also occasionally to seize local initiative, then that is at least circumstantial evidence, I think, for a difference in unit-to-unit combat power. But extrapolating that out to the bigger picture is very difficult. By this point, the Russian army is incredibly diverse. It includes everything literally from prison conscripts to pre-war professionals. So assessing the quality of the overall force is always going to be difficult. We know that running units headfirst into minefields at places like Volodar probably wasn't good for the overall status of the force. What we don't know is the quality and motivation of the forces that remain. As for the Ukrainian army, we know it was also hard-pressed over winter and early spring. Sources on both sides generally triangulate on the fact, for example, that in order to stabilise the situation in Bakhmut, Ukraine had to contribute some of its veteran and higher quality units. Yes, there were TDF and recently mobilised personnel, but there were also foreign legionnaires, high-quality mechanised and airborne formations, additional artillery brigades, and reportedly some Ukrainian special operations forces. Although with the casualties that they've taken over the course of the war, it's important to remember that not all Ukrainian special operators are still pre-war professionals. The casualties among some of these higher-tier formations were reported to have been heavy. If you want an absolute upper bound, the Russian Defense Ministry, Sergei Shoigu himself, claimed the Ukrainian army across the entire front lost 15,000 troops in the month of April. Although before you take that number as a given, I'd like to remind you the Russians also claim to have destroyed 416 Ukrainian fixed-wing aircraft, 230 helicopters, and nearly 1,100 MLRS systems. But even if that figure is significantly inflated, the units that have been committed to the front line in order to hold, defend it, and occasionally to counterattack are going to be tired. Equipment is going to be worn down and need to be replaced or maintained. And personnel and officers will have been lost. That's going to be particularly painful for Ukraine because some of these units will have participated in previous counterattacks at Kharkiv or Kherson. They're troops that, in an ideal world, probably would have been held in reserve for whatever comes next. But someone needed to hold the line and buy time over winter and early spring. These units got the job, and if you look at photos of what Bakhmut or Marinka look like now, it's clear that the cities broke before these troops did. Instead, the most commonly reported working theory is that Ukraine will primarily rely on new units to conduct its offensive actions. Prigozhin claims that Ukraine has mustered and trained up 200,000 new troops to conduct this offensive. That's probably hyperbole. What we do know is that Ukraine has been training up new brigades, many of them equipped primarily or partly with Western standard equipment, and that despite Russian pressure over the winter, they never felt the need to deploy these reserve formations to plug the gaps. Ukraine's new reserve forces can be split into a couple of categories. There are 9 newly formed Western brigades. These include a number of troops, although not all of them, who have been trained in Western countries and some Western tactics, equipped partly but not entirely with Western equipment. Then there are reconstituted volunteer-only formations, the so-called Offensive Guard, and a number of other brigades that have either been created or reconstituted by the regular Ukrainian army. The important top-level analysis here is that this is, on paper, a significant force, although it does fall short of what the Ukrainians were aiming to assemble in the first instance. It's also one that's had to make compromises on training time and equipment quality. The Ukrainians, for example, had said they needed 300 to 400 modern tanks. They got closer to 200. And so you see odd combinations like this one, with the 47th Mechanized operating American M2A2 Bradleys alongside upgraded T-55s. And while I'm sure the Ukrainians would rather have it than no tank at all, I doubt this is what the Ukrainians were hoping for when they asked for modern Western tanks. In summary, assessing the current quality of the Russian-Ukrainian armed forces is very difficult. But based on what we do know, I'd advance the following as a very tentative, low-confidence best guess. Overall, it seems like the Russian force might have some significant force quality issues. We derive that from the fact that they haven't trusted many of their units to operate in an offensive way, instead choosing to continuously redeploy elite units and PMCs to wherever the fighting is thickest. That will be balanced against the fact that many of these forces will be fighting on the defensive, where motivation, training, and force quality aren't as important. By contrast, the Ukrainians will be deploying a number of units that are fresh out of training, some with new equipment, some of which are made up entirely of motivated volunteers. All else being equal, you would expect that to yield a higher quality force. The problem is, many of these units will, by definition, be new and untested, and they'll be asked to do something complicated, combined armed operations and breakthroughs. It's unlikely, for example, that Ukraine will settle for a Bakhmut-style approach. It won't want to just fight block by block through individual cities, levelling them as they go, advancing a few hundred metres at a time. They're likely to want to substitute manoeuvre for casualties and fires. That requires skill in execution and coordination. The last year has, I think, indicated the Ukrainians are more than willing to fight. What we'll soon see is whether the limited amount of equipment and training provided over the winter is enough to give them what they need in order to carry out a complex operation against a determined opponent? It seems it probably won't be much longer until we discover the answer to that question. Because even as I prepare this video, it looks like both sides have started preparing the battlefield and setting conditions for the offensive to come. A long preparatory period isn't unusual for major offensives in Ukraine or elsewhere. During the First Gulf War, the air campaign went on for weeks before the ground offensive went in. And during the Kherson counteroffensive, long before the bulk of Ukrainian forces were engaged, Ukrainian HIMARS units were engaged in a protracted campaign targeting the Antonovsky Bridge and other logistical connections. Those attacks steadily throttled the ability of the Russians to resupply their frontline units, so once the Ukrainian offensive began and then continued, over time the ability of the Russians to resupply their artillery and forward units steadily degraded. In a sense, it's all about shaping the conditions to your advantage before the offensive goes in. In sport, if you sabotage the opposition's team bus so they never make it to the game and have to forfeit, that's cheating and very illegal. In war, if you're able to cause a bunch of trains to derail so critical supplies don't make their way to the front, well, that's just setting conditions. The main way this has manifested over the last several weeks has been attacks on logistical targets, particularly by the Ukrainians. Oil refineries and storages have been hit in locations including Crimea, Donetsk, and Russia. And while you may see pro-Russian claims that all the drones involved in a particular attack were shot down prior to hitting their targets, the satellite imagery and video evidence suggests that the Russians, if they are intercepting these drones, are often doing it using oil storage facilities. At the same time, we've seen chaos caused around other targets, one-way drone attacks against air bases, HIMARS attacks on ammunition because what is old is new again. And of course, the never-ending series of train derailments and smoking accidents in Russia proper. It's important to note that these attacks have not just targeted one particular section of the front. Oil storages are obviously very useful to support military operations. Ships and tanks consume an awful lot of the stuff. And so if Ukraine was only attacking targets in, say, Crimea or Zaporizhia or Donetsk, that might provide a clue as to the direction the counteroffensive was likely to be directed. Instead, the attacks and accidents have been spread out over a wide front. That likely doesn't just degrade Russian capabilities, it also forces the deployment of air defense assets and security forces to protect these assets across the entire threatened space. A Pantsir system might be entirely capable of dealing with shitty Alibaba drones. But if the Ukrainians are willing to fling those drones into anything vaguely flammable within 200 kilometers of the front line, then that may place pressure on Russian air defenses the same way Shahed attacks pressure the Ukrainians. Similarly, deploying more counter-drone electronic warfare assets isn't without cost. We've also seen a number of psychological operations. For example, the Ukrainians recently released a video featuring a HIMARS and its crew. It quite openly tried to play on the fear of the system, emphasizing that no HIMARS has been destroyed since the beginning of the war. And it gave the following ultimatum to Russian troops. It asked for Russian troops to submit the locations of weapon and ammunition dumps, claiming that as long as Ukraine had an acceptable supply of targets in any particular zone, it would refrain from targeting things like barracks and troop concentrations. Whether that will actually convince Russian troops to give up the locations of their ammunition depots in order to sleep a little more safely at night remains to be seen, but it certainly seems to have a psyops element to it. We've also seen an uptick in apparent reconnaissance activity by the Ukrainians reported by the Russians. This usually takes the form of relatively small groups of Ukrainian forces essentially poking at the Russian defences to essentially see what's there. In the war in Ukraine, a lot of this reconnaissance is being done by drone units. But in some cases, commanders will require the sort of intelligence you can only gather by giving the opposing defences a little bit of a prod. Those sort of operations aren't without cost. You can lose people and lose equipment doing this sort of thing. And so an uptick in Russians reporting these kind of actions, which to be fair are often reported as major Ukrainian offensives which are heroically thrown back, might suggest Ukrainian commanders are trying to clear up their picture of the battlefield. One thing which I don't think is connected to the counteroffensive, but which I have to talk about because it just happened, is the drone attack in inverted commas on the Kremlin. Obviously, there's still a lot of competing debate over who exactly was responsible, and to be honest, I don't want to get involved in that discussion because I don't have any new information to contribute. The one thing I do want to address is the Russian claim that this was an assassination attempt on Vladimir Putin. This was an attack by two tiny, what look vaguely like Mugen-type drones with a tiny payload, the one that detonated by the flag didn't damage the flag, and barely scorched the roof. So the only way I think you could construe this as an attempted assassination, given the payload and targeting involved, is if someone had credible intelligence that Vladimir Putin would be sleeping on the roof of that building at 2 AM, and that if he saw a drone incoming, his only response would have been to try and physically catch it, because that's the only way I can imagine that warhead actually having a lethal impact. In any case, that's the forces and the shaping operations we've seen. What should we expect of the counteroffensive to come? At this stage, it's important to note that basically every party involved, the Americans, the Ukrainians, the Russians, all of them are making multiple seemingly contradictory statements about the upcoming offensive. American General Chris Cavalli, for example, stressed confidence that Ukraine had everything it needed to be successful in a counteroffensive. But at the same time, other American statements are almost trying to distance America from any projections of Ukrainian success. One read on that might be that America is attempting to hedge, positioning themselves to point to the importance of the aid they have provided to Ukraine in the event that Ukraine is successful, while also tamping down expectations and distancing themselves in case anything fails. As an aside, tactics like that, and the Russian tendency to deny even the most obvious of defeats in their media, does make me wonder if and when modern governments have come to the conclusion that their populations can't handle any news of a potential reverse or defeat. Historically speaking, populations during major conflicts have expected that there would be reverses on the way to victory. Think of the British or Soviet populations during the Second World War, or indeed UN forces during the darkest days in Korea. Russian communications are likewise seemingly contradictory. They range from more of the standard, everything is under control and victory is inevitable, therefore Ukraine should surrender because Russian victory is inevitable, to Prigozhin claiming that Ukraine has 200,000 troops ready to counterattack, and unless something is done right this moment, Wagner and forces in the east are going to be annihilated. And Ukrainian communications on their surface seem almost as contradictory and confused. Sometimes we're being told the counteroffensive has begun, sometimes it will begin soon, sometimes it's still being prepared. And of course, there's never any clarity given around the final objectives. Sometimes allusions are made towards Crimea, sometimes towards other territories. Regarding these confusing statements, I would make one tentative suggestion. In a universe where it's very difficult to hide information, to keep something truly secret, an alternative to trying to be very, very quiet is instead to be very, very loud. Fill the airwaves with enough competing and clashing information. It's going to be very difficult for your opponent to find the one sound in there that actually speaks the truth. So if listening to Ukrainian communications makes you feeling confused as to whether the offensive has started or not, where it will be aimed, and what it is likely to achieve, well then good. If you want to get a job as a spokesman in politics or in business, then the ability to fill airtime while saying absolutely nothing is a critical skill. The only difference here is it's being employed to obscure military operations. But if the Ukrainians won't give us clues on where the counteroffensive will fall, perhaps we can look to the ever-reliable Russian media instead. And there some pro-Russian commentators have suggested that Ukraine's counteroffensive might take the form of a surprise crossing of the Dnipro River, which will probably stretch Ukrainian resources because there's also talk of an inevitable Ukrainian offensive in Zaporizhia. And indeed, at time of recording, some limited civilian evacuations from this area have been ordered. Of course, Ukraine might also be planning to counterattack in Donetsk, as Prigozhin insists. There he argues the flanks of Bakhmut are the most critical, as apparently tens of thousands of fresh Ukrainian troops are waiting in the wings to encircle it. That said, an offensive further to the north hasn't been ruled out, with discussions of a potential attack in Luhansk. Or indeed further north again, because Russian state TV commentators recently discussed the idea that Ukraine might just invade Russia and capture the city of Belgorod, so that they could then trade it away in some subsequent peace negotiation. Maybe they're just being confused by the apparent Ukrainian preparations for an attack further to the west, because Belarusian President Lukashenko has multiple times insisted that Ukraine is preparing to attack Belarus. He can probably sleep soundly, however, because no doubt the Ukrainian forces will be busy, because Russian Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev indicated as early as May last year that Poland was in the final stages of preparing to invade Ukraine and seize territories. So there you go. According to various Russian sources, the Ukrainian counteroffensive will be in Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, Russia around Belgorod, an invasion of Belarus, and the repulsion of a NATO invasion from the west. I really hope that helped clear things up. I say this not for the purpose of mockery, although Patrushev probably deserves some. but instead to highlight just how many clashing narratives are out there. If official statements are useless to, however, we can instead focus on the physical battlefield and previous experience. Looking at both, I think the first thing to tentatively say is that lightning gains, while possible, are unlikely. It's incredibly easy to act like this is a game of hearts of iron and just draw a big red line to Mariupol or Berdyansk, and conclude that, hey, Ukraine just needs to drive to the Azov Sea and cut off Crimea like that is the easiest thing in the world. The reality, however, is that with the exception of the Kharkiv counteroffensive and the earliest Russian attacks, most of this war has been defined by hard positional fighting. Russia has spent 9 months digging their way through Bakhmut, and they've also spent months constructing complex concentric rings of defensive fortifications, basically on every front. Wherever Ukraine chooses to advance, it's going to have to deal with things like minefields, the things that undid the Russian offensive at Vuhledar. It's going to have to deal with trenches, with Russian aircraft, with Russian artillery, and layers of prepared defences. And at the same time, it's going to have to do it as an army that is used to fighting using fires, using artillery and missiles, rather than manoeuvre and breakthrough. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that a breakthrough is impossible. It's possible. But if past experience is any indication, in this war, often when you see manoeuvre, it's often enabled by attrition. It's because one side gets too weak to hold its positions, and then it gets overrun. Kharkiv was pre-Russian mobilization. It was likely enabled by manpower shortages in the Russian army. The fact that so many troops had been redirected to places like Donetsk, that there weren't enough troops to hold the line in Kharkiv, and Ukraine took advantage of that situation. That's very unlikely to be the situation here. So whatever front the Ukrainians choose to advance on, a large sweeping advance doesn't seem like the most likely outcome, at least compared to periods of hard attritional fighting, potentially followed by the seizure of territory. And with that comes the obvious point that losses are inevitable. I'm not sure how many times I've repeated the argument that the Russian army is still dangerous, but I'm going to repeat it again here. The Russian army is still a large and dangerous force, deeply dysfunctional in some areas to be sure, but still dangerous. Ukraine has received some Western kit, some Western battle tanks, some Western IFVs. That Western equipment may have a qualitative advantage over some Russian and Soviet-era equipment, but it isn't invulnerable. And given it's going into a demanding offensive operation, a lot of this stuff is going to be destroyed. Given enough time, we will inevitably see videos and images of destroyed Bradleys and destroyed Leopards. And you can bet that footage will be played for its maximum information value. The key is that we will be seeing those things whether the offensive succeeds or not. And the final thing I'll add here, which I'll then go on to explain, is that while a lot of media has covered the upcoming offensive as the last great act that will determine the fate of Ukraine one way or another, I actually don't think that however this offensive ends, it's likely to mark the end of the war. And if that wasn't true, the Ukrainians might not be launching it at all. Now, I know you were all waiting to see how I hijacked a topic on a potential counteroffensive and turned it into one about defense economics. Here you go, the trap is sprung. Because the argument here is that both Ukraine and Russia have a pool of available resupply that means they can probably endure at least one military disaster. And as a result, they have room to take risks, like the Russian winter offensive or the upcoming Ukrainian one. Now, it's pretty clear that Ukraine's ability to launch this upcoming counteroffensive has been enabled by the resupply that it's received from the West. It may not have received everything it wanted, but a lot of those new brigades owe their existence to the training efforts and resupply of the various Western powers. Now, on one hand, Ukraine's counteroffensive is likely to be less powerful than it could have because of the slow pace of delivery of many of the pledged weapon systems. But ironically, on the flip side, that also means Ukraine has a pool of incoming replacements that it knows it can rely on. For example, according to the Oryx compilation, there are more pledged infantry fighting vehicles that have yet to be delivered to Ukraine than have already been delivered. There are more than 180 pledged tanks that haven't yet been delivered, and to that I'll add a likely earmark that the Polish are likely to send most of the rest of the PT-91 fleet as modern tanks like Abrams and Korean K2 tanks begin to arrive. There's also a range of ground-based air defense systems that will arrive eventually, and new capabilities like long-range missiles from the UK that will arrive eventually. An interesting observation that may be a temporary deviation or a new normal is that a lot of the new heavy hardware, not the ammunition which is still largely coming from the US, but a lot of the new heavy platforms and systems are coming from the European powers. A lot of media attention, for example, was garnered when the US agreed to send just over 100 M2A2 Bradleys. Much less widely covered was the announcement that Poland was going to be sending 100 Rosa-Mach infantry fighting vehicles now and producing 100 additional ones for delivery in the future. If you look at the recent delivery of self-propelled guns, because the Ukrainian artillery has been suffering under Lancet attacks, there are 16 US M109A6 Paladins that are believed to be in theatre. But recently announced or delivered, there have been 19 Danish Caesar 155mm 8x8s, there are the 32 UK AS90s, and up to 60 Italian M109Ls will eventually be delivered. And even if this material isn't arriving in time for the counteroffensive, it gives the Ukrainians the confidence to launch the attack regardless. Because even in the event there are losses or setbacks, because there are likely to be losses or setbacks in any offensive, they can be confident it's not going to gut the Ukrainian army because the equipment is incoming to replace and build it back up as quickly as possible. The same argument applies for munitions. If Ukraine wasn't sure about its near-term ammunition supply, it probably couldn't afford the additional expenditures that come from an offensive operation. Instead, what we've been seeing is sluggish and belated but concrete efforts to improve defence industrial output in the European Union and the United States. The EU, for example, through its Act in Support of Ammunition Production, or ASAP, which wins a prize for an effective acronym and therefore is a good program, will make €500 million available to help support increases in ammunition production capacity. The goal is not just to deliver Ukraine 1 million rounds of howitzer ammunition within 12 months, it's to increase European production capacity to 1 million rounds within 12 months, so that there is some confidence in the ability of the defence industrial base to meet Ukraine's needs not just immediately but also going forward. Meanwhile, in the United States, we're also starting to see a payoff for efforts to increase and scale production there too. Production of Gimler's rockets for HIMARS should increase from 6,000 per annum to 14,000 per annum, production of the HIMARS itself from 60 to 96. And the side effect of realising those economies of scale is that even in a high inflation environment where costs should be going up, prices of key systems are instead coming down. Prices on the Gimler's rockets, for example, are going down by 11%. It'll take time for planned capacity to turn into rounds produced. But knowing the capacity is going to be there gives the Ukrainian command more freedom to expend some of the resources they have available now in order to try and secure some momentum. And that's important because Russia is signalling very clearly that they're doing the same. And in terms of claimed increases in production, Shoigu claims they're doing a better job of it than many in the West, increasing production of basic armaments by 160% and of certain undefined key systems by 700%. And there are specific numbers available for certain systems like tanks and BMP-3s. For tanks, Medvedev claims that Russia will produce or modernize/restore 1,500 tanks per annum. While for the BMP-3 IFV, Rostek claims that it delivered more in Q1 of 2023 than all of 2019. Based on available estimates of their 2019 production numbers, that would give an annualised rate of between 440 and 600, which isn't enough to make up for the visually confirmed loss rate of Russian-tracked IFVs. But it would be a significant number of vehicles to help slow the ongoing decay. Again, though, these are official figures. I'll also note there have been some moves that make a great deal of sense, like a movement towards simplified weapons like gliding bombs. And then, because it's Russia, there have also been some apparently stupid decisions, like prioritising funds to ramp up scale production of the Tu-160M strategic bomber, an extremely expensive, hard-to-maintain, variable geometry strategic bomber whose only contribution to the war in Ukraine is as one of the most expensive ways possible to launch cruise missiles. In other words, a lot of what Ukraine is amassing through its Western allies aren't just pledges, they're pipelines. It's not just new trained troops, it's training programs that will continue to turn out new recruits month after month. It's not just ammunition deliveries, it's new production capacity that will continue to turn out shells month after month. And the strength of those pipelines relative to the Russian ones informs two things: the confidence with which Ukraine can counterattack, and the strength of their hand at the negotiating table. Because it's the strength of your pipeline that determines whether you have to make a last desperate gambler's throw of the dice, or whether you can put on your best Captain America accent, shake off defeat, pick up your shield, and declare proudly that you could do this all day. War is sometimes a grim game of endurance. and Ukraine's offensive ambitions suggest it still feels it has a lot in the tank. And while it might be a tad depressing to think of this war going into 2024, I think a quick thought exercise can help demonstrate why it's probably likely. We've talked before about how, unless there is room for a genuine consensus, wars can continue until one side chooses to give up or lacks the physical ability to continue. There are no TKOs or judge-awarded victories. Either the other guy is throwing in the towel or it's going to a knockout. And so if you're expecting a single counteroffensive to end a conflict, you sort of have to ask yourself, is there any scenario in which it leaves either of the combatants either knocked out cold or reaching for the towel? For example, assume for a moment a worst-case scenario for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Let's say Zelensky gets very, very drunk, he fires Zaluzhny, replaces the general staff with the Warcraft 2 AI, and the Ukrainian military does its best Volodar impression by lemming charging all 9 of its new brigades into Russian minefields with precious little to show for it. Does even that cartoonishly extreme scenario actually end the war? I would argue probably not by a long shot. In terms of military capacity, Ukraine has already proven that it can hold off Russian offensives using just the existing forces that it has at the front, not the force it's been generating for this offensive. New equipment and new recruits are in the pipeline. So while the losses would be extremely painful, a lot of them could be made up. And in terms of will to continue, most Ukrainians, when polled, suggest that they want to fight on to reclaim their territories, even if Western support is withdrawn or even if there is a nuclear attack on Kyiv. So while there would, I'm sure, be immense disappointment and a potential morale shock, the evidence available suggests they'd probably choose to keep going. It would be a painful disaster. They'd probably replace the Warcraft 2 AI with at least an upgrade to the StarCraft 2 version, but the end result is probably Zelensky and the European Union declaring that they don't hear no bell. And the greater risk would probably be to ongoing foreign support as opposed to the local military situation, something we'll talk about more soon. But the extreme upside is more interesting from a strategic perspective. A wildly successful Ukrainian counteroffensive might encircle a significant Russian force, it might threaten Crimea, or it might reclaim a reasonable proportion of the territory that Russia has occupied. But even if the situation was utterly catastrophic, there's no reason that Russia would have to acknowledge the defeat immediately. Despite what the occasional meme template would have you think, Ukrainian troops can't go to Moscow. And so if Russia chose to declare additional mobilization to try and pull additional forces together to push on even if the odds of victory were not great, then further military successes and economic pressure would ultimately be required. So a massive Ukrainian victory could bring the end of the war significantly closer, but it probably wouldn't end it without considerable follow-up. And as for the possibility of a negotiated solution without further fighting, for the moment that appears off the table. And while I acknowledge viewpoints on the reasons might differ, I would point the finger squarely at Russia's stated war goals. Russia has declared that any peace deal must recognize their supposed annexation of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea. For Ukraine, and for a majority of the global community, including some of Russia's friends and allies, that is a non-starter. For Ukraine, it would mean handing over vast parts of its internationally recognized territory, subjecting millions of its people to Russian occupation, all with very little in the way of assurance that Russia wouldn't try for even more territory in the future. Very few countries internationally recognize any of Russia's supposed annexations. Very notably, that includes the People's Republic of China. And there might be reasons, for example, that Beijing would be nervous setting the legal precedent that a breakaway region could stage a referendum, declare independence, and immediately place itself under the armed protection of a foreign power. You know, the way Russia claims that these regions did. Until there is a shift in these Russian demands, I'd rule the probability of a peace deal as being quite slim. So if even a wildly successful offensive is unlikely to win the war even of itself, and is likely to consume considerable resources and cost significant Ukrainian lives, you might ask why it's inevitable that Kyiv would launch it at all. After all, from a certain position, it might look like Russia's geopolitical position is just deteriorating over time. Wait them out and they might come to the negotiating table. Diplomatically, you could argue that Russia's position isn't ironclad. 122 nations, including India and the People's Republic of China, recently voted for a UN resolution, which in its preamble described Russian aggression towards Georgia and Ukraine as a challenge. Both nations had abstained on the motion to introduce that language into the resolution, but after it made it in, They voted for the motion as a whole. This isn't exactly a diplomatic earthquake, but it also isn't exactly a declaration of lifelong friendship between Beijing and Moscow. Russia's campaign to demilitarize NATO and reduce its military capacity is also falling apart in real time. As I suspected many videos ago where I talked about aid to Ukraine, this is particularly pronounced in the United States. Because while billions have been earmarked in Ukraine supplementals, much of that money is being spent in the United States. Because what appears to be happening is the United States Army or other service has been sending equipment to Ukraine and getting a supplemental for a significant part of the replacement cost for that equipment. But that doesn't mean the services are doing one-for-one replacements. When the Army sends M113s to Ukraine, it's not using the supplemental funding to buy new M113s, it's buying modern AMPV armoured vehicles instead. And with the same process happening in countries in Europe as well, cough Poland. The longer Russia continues, the more it seems to be driving NATO military modernisation while also expending its own Soviet legacy. And despite talk of Ukraine fatigue in the media, Ukraine's had a pretty good few months in terms of securing additional commitments. These are critical in terms of signalling that Russia can't expect to just grind down Ukraine's finances and military over time. So we've seen Germany pledge an additional 3.2 billion euros specifically in military support in 2023, and 8.8 billion euros beyond that timeline. Other nations have made considerable commitments for 2023 or 24, and Japan came in recently with a $5 billion package. Perhaps most significantly, the South Korean government is openly discussing the idea of supplying weapons to Ukraine. That would transform Ukraine's access to armoured vehicles, artillery, and most critically, to ammunition. But all in all, over the last 2 months, it's been the European commitments that have been the most notable. As for why those commitments continue to escalate probably reflects complex local and regional politics. Although I might humbly suggest to whoever is running the Russian charm offensive that if you're trying to win European capitals over, it's probably best not to have state TV openly discuss nuking their capitals to cinders on a regular basis. I know there are plenty of different ways to make friends out there, but threatening to kill millions usually isn't near the top of the list. But the reality is the Ukrainians probably don't feel that they can afford to sit and rest on their laurels. In an ideal world where aid was infinite, continuous, and reliable, it might make sense to sit on the defensive, to wait for sanctions to play out and for political conditions inside Russia itself to change. But for reasons both foreign and domestic, I don't think that's a realistic possibility. Because going on the attack is about more than just changing the military situation, it's about changing the political narrative, demonstrating that you have the initiative, and also about increasing the rate at which Russia burns through its resources. Because while the Russian economy and military industry might be able to keep up the equivalent of a slow walk forever, force them into a sprint and perhaps something will eventually break. But at the end of the day, there are probably two big political considerations that you can't walk past. The first is American support. Now make no mistake, America remains the biggest contributor of aid to Ukraine by a significant margin. And many of its political leaders continue to say that they're going to be with Ukraine for as long as it takes. But as a rule, when I have a chance to read budgets or read political transcripts, I'm going to choose the budgets every time. And when you look at the budgets, there are some serious questions. The currently voted funding for Ukraine in the United States is intended to flow through to the end of September. Beyond that, it'll come down to what's in the new US budget. If you're paying attention, you may have noticed that America is currently in a political knife fight as they debate whether or not the wealthiest economy in the world should default or not. Now, in that context, it appears the decision has been made not to put most of the funding for Ukraine in fiscal year 2024 in the core budget request. It's not in the defense budget, and only a comparatively small amount, $7 billion, most of which isn't actually for Ukraine, is in the core budget request. On one hand, that reduces the odds of someone in Congress blowing up the US economy because they oppose giving aid to Ukraine. And the intention appears to be to fund Ukraine much the way they did in 2022 and 2023 through the use of supplementals. This is where Congress votes separately on a bill that basically includes spending only for Ukraine. Now that might work, but it also means that Ukraine has no guarantees of what it might get in future. If the politics in Congress ever shift suddenly against it, then the next supplemental may fail, and Ukraine is in serious trouble. At the same time, there's been significant frustration over the pace of delivery for certain US systems. Republican Senator Tom Cotton recently called out the fact that despite having thousands of Abrams tanks, The American military still wasn't sure how to source and deliver 31 of them for Ukraine, with the senator suggesting that political will might have something to do with it. So you might be forgiven for suggesting that Ukraine wants to show that it can retain the initiative and make progress, to perhaps breathe a little bit of impetus into those assistance efforts. And you'd probably forgive them for doing so given some of the coverage. Russia Today, for example, recently reported on comments by Republican Congressman Michael McCall, essentially suggesting that American public support for ongoing aid to Ukraine was likely linked to the results of the upcoming counterattack. Now, McCall himself has criticised the administration for not sending enough weapons to Ukraine, and so the published comments seem to reflect less personal conviction and more a suspicion around the overall political landscape. If foreign politicians and publics expect proof that Ukraine can retain the initiative and make progress, then the military in Ukraine is going to feel an impetus to deliver. But while this is the element that observers usually focus on, I actually suspect it's only part of the motivation, because the Ukrainian government faces pressure not just from foreign allies, but also from its own people. At the moment, between 16 and 17% of Ukraine's territory is under Russian occupation, along with a significant number of Ukrainian people. For those who aren't under occupation, many are within the range of Russian artillery or missile attacks. Frontline cities like Kherson feel that fact acutely every time an artillery shell hits a shopping mall. And in areas controlled by the Russian Federation, recent announcements suggest things are going to change even further. Earlier this year, the ICC issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin in relation to the alleged deportation of thousands of Ukrainian children from occupied territories. Putin's response to ICC charges for deporting children seems to have been to begin deporting adults as well. A recent decree signed by the Russian president basically gives Ukrainians in the occupied territories a choice. They can accept Russian passports, give away their Ukrainian identity, and say that they are Russians. Noting, of course, in this scenario that some of them may have lost family. Some of them may have had friends or colleagues killed fighting for Ukraine against Russian forces, and now they're being asked to take up Russian passports, citizenship, and identity. And the alternative, of course, is deportation, losing one's home, one's personal property. In some cases, it would involve people being thrown out of the only home they have ever known. Stop me if this is ringing any historical bells. And so Ukraine will likely attack and keep attacking. It will likely do so as long as it has equipment, funds, and soldiers capable of carrying on the fight. Because the occupation zones are more than just lines on abstract maps that people on YouTube make daily commentary videos about. They're real territories with implications for thousands or millions of real people. If a counteroffensive pushes Russian artillery out of range of a major city, then the residents of that city can live in a greater degree of peace. If a village, a town, or a settlement are retaken, then the residents of that territory don't have to fear deportation. So while a counteroffensive, win, lose, or draw, may not dramatically adjust the fundamental military balance between Russia and Ukraine, it might make all the difference in the world for thousands or millions of Ukrainians. And based on historical precedent, that's exactly the sort of motivation that can send troops into the attack. In conclusion, Ukraine has compelling political and military incentives to launch a counteroffensive, and I would suggest that shaping actions for that are already visible. The status of the opposing forces and the probability of success is very difficult to determine. It would appear Ukraine does have a force with which to launch an offensive and may have a qualitative advantage, although those advantages will now be matched against Russian edges in quantity, air power, and defensive fortifications. An offensive may or may not dramatically change the underlying military situation in Ukraine, but by itself I'd suggest it's unlikely to end the war. Instead, political and economic factors will continue to play their vital role. But months of patience, hard sacrifices, and carefully husbanded resources have given the Ukrainians a chance. Only time will tell what happens when they take it. Okay, channel update to close out, and a brief one because I'm still travelling. First of all, I know I delayed this video despite a vote to bring it out sooner, and I'm glad I did, as it allowed me to factor in certain things like Prigozhin's recent announcements or the escalation of the anti-logistics drone campaign. Of course, bringing out the hypersonics video a week earlier also had its costs. It's just my luck that I sit on a hypersonics video for months, and then the week after I posted, a Patriot reportedly smacks a Kinzhal. Regarding the content of this week's video, I hope you understand my caution. The quality of information to make concrete predictions simply isn't there, and I think it would be to do you a disservice to claim otherwise. What I've tried to do is present you the information that I do think we have access to, and I hope you found it useful. Finally, thank you very much to all of you who sent me emails or messages, letting me know that I'd received a call out from Richard Iron of the Australian Institute for International Affairs. It's always great to see this material referenced elsewhere, and I don't always see it when it happens. So thanks very much to those of you who gave me the heads up. With me recording without my usual setup, I hope the sound quality this week has been pretty decent, and that you all got something out of this week's episode. Thank you very much to all of you, and I'll see you again next week.